My name is Karen Hill, and I'm in St. John's, Newfoundland. Today is the 29th of February, 1984, and today I'm interviewing Miss Ella Brett. Miss Brett has had long experience in social work education in Newfoundland. Miss Brett, in order to begin, I wonder if you might tell us when and where you were born, and a little bit about your early life.
Yes, does that mean I have to give my date of birth?
Only if you choose to.
I was born at Morton's Harbour, which is a small community on the northeast coast of Newfoundland. As you may know, most of the communities in Newfoundland are coastal communities.
Excuse me. Can we stop for a second? Have your microphone.
What?
To begin again, then, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about when and where you were born in your early life.
Well, I was born in a community called Morton's Harbour, which is a coastal community on the northeast coast of Newfoundland. As you may know, most of the communities in Newfoundland are coastal communities, other than the inland towns. It was a very small community, very close-knit, perhaps around 400 people living there. And I went to school, of course, in that community. And later, when I was around 17, 18, I suppose, I attended Memorial University for a couple of years. Then went to Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia for a couple of years. I returned to Newfoundland, which of course is my native province. I returned to Newfoundland, and I think that was in 1946, and worked for about 5 years with the Department of Public Health, the government of Newfoundland. Now, of course, you understand that we were not a province of Canada at that time. We didn't become a province until 1949. We had certainly been in Newfoundland a long time. When we united with Canada, that's only 35 years ago, which is a very short time. But we had been in Newfoundland, of course, for about 300 years.
As I was driving down this morning, there was a sign at the outskirts of St. John's saying it's the oldest incorporated city in Canada.
Yes, yes.
Number of 100 years.
Yes, oh yes, it's St. John's is a very old city. We were, of course, we were a country, of course, before we became part of Canada. We were a British Dominion. We were a British colony first, of course, and then we became a British Dominion. We had our own currency and our own stamps. We were a small country, of course. But in 1949, of course, we did decide, to become Canadians, and thus we became part of North American industrial country.
I'm wondering if we could go back to your earlier life for a few minutes. I'm wondering, were you in Morton's Cove during the Depression?
Morton's Harbour during the Depression, yes, yes. I was growing up there at that time.
What was it like in that community during the Depression?
Well, during the Depression, it perhaps wasn't nearly as bad as it might have been in more urban areas. I don't remember, there wasn't very much what was called then able-bodied relief. We refer to it these days, of course, as the employable unemployed, but it was called able-bodied relief. There wasn't very much. There were a few people who were sick, who probably received assistance of some kind. But the fishery continued, although prices were low, of course. And the people, of course, produced much of what they needed in the way of food. They grew all their own vegetables. They kept animals, sheep and chickens, geese, and that sort of thing, and produced a good deal of their own meat. Of course, we had lots of good fish of various kinds, So that I'm not sure that there was as much suffering really as perhaps in some of the urban centers.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a relieving officer for your own community there? Do you remember?
Yes, I think it must have been at Tullingate that there was a relieving officer.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in Morton's Harbour, belonged to Tullingate district.
Mm-hmm.
And the relieving officer, I believe, lived at Tullingate.
In order to help us understand a little bit more about what Newfoundland was like at the time, so we understand the progress that's been made. Again, were you in that community during the Second World War?
During the Second World War, no. I was at Memorial University in St. John's from 1942 to 1944. 1944 to 46, I was in Nova Scotia.
Mm-hmm.
I returned in 1946 to Newfoundland.
Mm-hmm. What was it like in St. John's during the war, 42 to 44?
Well, you see, the Second World War brought great prosperity to Newfoundland. It's too bad that they had to have a war to bring prosperity, but nevertheless that was so. Our country, of course, we were not part of Canada then, but our country became very important to the American military operations. The Americans constructed military and naval bases here, several of them. And many Newfoundlanders, of course, found employment in the construction and maintenance of those military bases. And it actually caused a shift in population, really, because people moved to the areas where the military bases were being constructed. They moved to find, of course, much needed employment. So you get then, of course, the beginning of a more urban kind of life. And the Second World War, certainly, we had too many American servicemen here, you see. And there was more money, of course, because people found more employment outside the fishery. And then, of course, the big event that occurred in the 1940s, of course, was Confederation of Canada in 1949. That was a major event, of course, in Newfoundland's history.
Mm-hmm. You had, I'm anxious to talk about Confederation, but I'm trying to cover the period before then.
Yes.
You had decided to go into nursing, I believe it was.
No,
Before that, no?
I was interested in public health. And when I returned to Newfoundland from Acadia University in 1946, I was employed with the Department of Public Health in Newfoundland. And my area of interest was nutrition. I was very interested in that as a part of public health, mainly in nutrition education. That was very interesting. I had about 5 years' experience
Mm-hmm.
in the Department of Public Health.
Nutrition was a big issue in Newfoundland during the 40s and the late 40s and the early 50s, wasn't it?
Oh yes, it was. The Department of Public Health was very anxious to improve the diet of Newfoundlanders. And we had a weekly radio program at that time, for instance. I used to, as a nutritionist then, working with the Department of Health, I traveled a fair amount throughout the island, visiting schools and local groups, particularly in the interest of nutrition education.
Mm-hmm. Some of the problems that I remember reading about were there were high rates of tuberculosis and of infant mortality in Newfoundland. Were those the kinds of issues that as a nutritionist you were trying to address?
Yes, we knew from nutrition surveys that had been done. The government, of course, the Newfoundland government knew. There was a high incidence of tuberculosis, and the infant mortality rate was quite high. That was the reason for starting a nutrition education program,
Mm-hmm.
because of the surveys that had been done.
And it was during that time, the time that you were doing your work as a nutritionist, that the discussion about Confederation was going on?
Yes, yes.
Were you involved in those discussions?
Every Newfoundlander was involved in the discussion of what was going to happen. We were then self-supporting, and did we want to return to a responsible government as a British Dominion? Did we want to retain what was called commission of government in Newfoundland? Or did we want to join Canada? And I think every Newfoundlander was involved in that. It was a tremendous issue for everybody. And when we made the decision, of course, in 1949, that was really a momentous kind of decision.
There was, the decision was a close one, wasn't it?
Yes, yes. 52%, I think, voted for, Newfoundlanders voted for Confederation with Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it was that Newfoundlanders were not interested or didn't like Canada. I think it was that we'd been so long on our own. We didn't really, I would think the majority of Newfoundlanders didn't really want to join any country very much.
Mm-hmm.
It was a struggle, I think. Perhaps for me, I think it was that my heart said no, my head said yes. In that sense,
Mm-hmm.
that there was something about being a country on our own. There's something to be said for that. Yet at the same time, I think there was recognition on the part of many people that an island jutting out in the Atlantic Ocean off to itself was perhaps not sensible, trying to struggle on our own.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a very emotional issue.
Mm-hmm.
Now, granted, we were joining a sister dominion when we joined Canada. And of course, there is great loyalty here in Newfoundland, I think, to the British Crown, to the Commonwealth. And of course, we were joining Canada as a member of the Commonwealth. Nevertheless, I think it was a hard decision for Newfoundlanders to make.
On the one side is the emotion of patriotism and history. There were also some logical facts or reasons that were being used as advantages for Newfoundlanders. What kind of discussion took place about the reason, the facts of benefit?
I think primarily economic reasons. We would be joining a larger country. And there were benefits, certainly there were benefits from that point of view. And we expected, I think, that we would have some help in developing our resources. So that we could create new wealth. These were some of the issues. And of course, the social welfare benefits were also, of course, pretty important. Not as a way of life, I don't mean that, but that they would be very helpful because we had widows' pensions, I guess, at that time. We had old age pensions, and there was public relief. But we weren't able to afford to pay very much in the way of assistance to older people or to widows or in the area of public relief. And certainly if we joined Canada, these benefits would accrue to us, the same benefits that accrue to the Canadians.
Mm-hmm. As a social worker, I would think today that would have been an important argument. Is it your perception that the people in Newfoundland saw that Social Security benefits of Confederation as being an important factor?
I expect so, yes. Yes. Particularly, the struggle was great for a lot of people in Newfoundland. The struggle really to survive in some areas. For instance, large areas on the south coast, so rocky you can't even grow a kitchen garden to help, with food and so on. But I would think that it played a role, yes. Social welfare benefits would be greater. But I think the other thing of being part of a country, another country, a larger country, and having some help in developing our resources and creating new wealth, not just getting social welfare benefits from Canada, that we would be able to create new wealth and contribute also to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that was effective.
Mm-hmm. Following Confederation, what kinds of changes did you see?
Well, probably in the beginning would be the social welfare benefits that accrued as soon as we became part of Canada. I think the old age pension in Canada in 1949 was $40 a month. I may not be correct. I think it was $40 a month, which was much more than we were providing. Now, $40 a month doesn't seem to be much in 1984, but in 1949, $40 a month was considerable amount.
Mm-hmm.
We had no program, for instance, unemployment insurance. Canada's program for unemployment insurance had come into effect already in 1940. So in 1949, when we became part of Canada, of course, the unemployment insurance program came into effect. We had no family allowance program. And that had come into effect in Canada in 1944, when we became a province, of course. Family allowances became available to the commanders.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly better assistance rates that would help people unable to maintain themselves towards a health and decency standard of living.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly the rates of assistance here prior to that certainly did not approach that idea at all of a health and decency standard of living.
Yeah. Did you see changes, effects from Confederation on your job as a nutritionist?
Oh yes, I think very early you would see some effects of that, yes. I think people were able to buy more, purchase more in the way of food, for instance. I think that people were able to purchase more for children's clothing. Certainly there was more money.
Mm-hmm. And as people had more money to spend, they would buy better food, and their health would improve.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah. After a period of time as a nutritionist, you decided to do something different. What happened then?
Well, that was, I guess, in 1951. I had been with the Department of Public Health for 5 years. I decided to go to social work. It wasn't that I didn't like the field of nutrition, but of course it's a narrow field in comparison with social work, perhaps. And I enjoyed my years with the Department of Public Health very much, really. So I went to Toronto and studied social work at the University of Toronto School of Social Work, and returned to Newfoundland again.
Mm-hmm.
Always return to Newfoundland.
Always.
We always return to the rock, as they say. And I think it's a lovely rock.
Yeah, yes, we do. When you, a couple questions about why you decided. One was, why did you go to the University of Toronto rather than, say, Dalhousie or some other university?
Well, the Department of Public Welfare here, the Provincial Department of Public Welfare, had been sending people to Toronto at the School of Social Work to do some training in social work. And I'm not sure exactly why I decided that. Perhaps it was due to the fact that the Provincial Department of Public Welfare was trying to upgrade their staff and were sending people to Toronto. Also, the Toronto School of Social Work, some faculty members came here during summers to do in-service training, public welfare workers. And Professor John Morgan, for instance, of the Toronto School of Social Work, was here a number of times. Also Ray Godfrey, of the Toronto School of Social Work. But in any case, I went to Toronto. I think perhaps for Newfoundlanders, or some people anyway, once we move off the rock, we're likely to go further than the Atlantic provinces.
Mm-hmm.
Once we move from Newfoundland, we're likely to go further than that.
Yes,
Yes.
right. When you were at the University of Toronto, what kinds of courses were you taking there?
Well, the courses then, social services was an important course. The history of social services in Canada, the issues of social policy in Canada, that sort of thing. And courses in casework, of course. Then, at that time, we were community organization. Social work in the law, social work in health, and of course the field component of the social work education program was very important, where we spent 2 days in the field.
Where did you do your placement at?
I did a placement at the Department of Public Welfare in Toronto. That was City of Toronto, the minister of the program. And that was, of course, very, very interesting. I enjoyed that very much.
What kind of work were you doing during that placement?
Well, I was doing work with unmarried parents, foster care, older people. See children. Yes, that would be, as I recall it now.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps there are other instances.
Yeah. Was it social assistance work that you were doing during that placement, or was it more casework and counseling?
It was both. In foster care, of course, in children's services, that was not public assistance, but it was both.
Mm-hmm. And did you do another field placement as well?
No.
During the period of time that you were there faculty or other students that sort of stick out in your mind?
Well, Ray Godfrey, of course, at the Toronto School of Social Work. Shirley Brownwine was a faculty advisor of mine. And very good faculty advisors who was always so very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Professor John Morgan, of course. There were others, I can't remember offhand. Professor Jeffrey was another.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Jeffrey. There are others I just can't think of names at the moment.
Were you the lone Newfoundlander at the school at that time?
There was one other person. There was a man. I can't recall his name now. I think there were just the two of us.
it must have been a very different kind of experience in, say, the Toronto Department of Public Welfare from what you had been experiencing here in St. John's. Could you see a relevance between what you were learning there and what you might get by here?
Well, yes, I think so. I at that time anyway, I think public welfare in Toronto was not very different from public welfare here. Assistance grants were better, I think. But in public welfare, whether in Newfoundland, or in Toronto, I think the most need for people in society reach public welfare departments. The Department of Public Welfare here is known now as the Department of Social Services. But the most need for people do reach public welfare departments. Often, it is the last place they can turn for help. And therefore, of course, provincial departments of social services, public welfare, they have very large responsibilities because it is a fact that the most need for people in society eventually, I think.
When you finished at the University of Toronto and returned to Newfoundland, what was your first job here?
I went into administration in child welfare services, particularly in the area of adoption at that time. Now, child welfare services, things didn't develop here, you see, the way that they developed in other provinces of Canada. We were not a province of Canada until 1949, and the first child welfare legislation we had was in 1944. Whereas in other provinces of Canada, such legislation had been enacted many years before that. I believe in Ontario, the first child welfare legislation was 1893. So child welfare was new in Newfoundland, you see. And our legislation was very similar to the legislation in Ontario. There was provision for the formation of children's aid societies in our legislation, but no children's aid societies were ever formed in Newfoundland, not even in St. John's. Child welfare services were administered and carried out by the provincial department of public welfare at that time. The services were similar to those in other provinces in the early 1950s. There were services to unmarried parents, child protection, and foster care and adoption. But I was involved. I wasn't involved as a frontline worker. I was involved in the administration of services.
Were there what kinds of services did exist in Newfoundland? Similar to Ontario, but I wonder what the services were. Foster homes and daycare centers and were there orphanages? How did things operate in child welfare?
Yes. Well, prior to the legislation, child welfare legislation, which didn't come into being until 1944, there were, of course, the children's orphanages operated by the churches. And there wasn't as much need, you see, until the 1940s. Newfoundland was a very rural society. People living in small fishing villages around 6,000 miles of coastline. Newfoundland's coastline is very indented, as you know, perhaps. All kinds of little coves and harbors, hideaway coves and harbors, where people settled, to fish. And the family, of course, looked after its own pretty much. The family looked after the older people. The family looked after the disabled family. But in the 1940s, as things began to change, and the trend to a more urban kind of living, well then you see problems arise that can't be handled, by the family. Now, of course, the church was always very important. The church, it's benevolent funds and so on. And of course, the church has operated the children's orphanages. Juvenile delinquency, I think, was not much of a problem, until the 1940s. There would be some. I think the first boys' home and training school was established in the 1940s, but there would not have been very much, children running afoul of the law. Child protection. I think just in the larger centres, was there much need for child protection services prior to the 1940s.
Then the event that happened during that period of time was the urbanization.
Yes.
That occurred as the military bases and the war and all that drew people to more urban centers.
Yes. The period of the 1940s was a very important decade for Newfoundland and Newfoundlanders, you see. And of course it was climaxed with our joining Canada in 1949. So big changes were occurring, you see.
Did Confederation make a difference in child welfare?
It did, in the sense that there was more money for staff. There was more money generally, for the social services. And certainly that would have been a very important factor in child welfare, having more staff. Particularly for the more urban areas, St. John's, of course, and then other areas such as Cornwall and Black Falls, the larger towns.
In the area of child welfare, when we began that work, which was, 1953, was it?
About that time, yes.
How did children come into care, or how did they come to the attention of the department, for what kinds of reasons? Same as now?
Certainly, I would say that some of them came into care, perhaps only a few though, because of poverty alone, which is not a good thing. I mean, we really don't want to keep children at home just because of poverty. We'd rather provide more assistance in the way of economic assistance, a few of them. But there would be some children in need of protection who are actually neglected. There would be some of these, yes. Certainly, I don't remember physical abuse of children. That's a much more recent development. At that time, I don't remember any case of physical abuse. There was neglect in the sense of parents not doing something, not keeping their children in school, or not looking after their children, that sort of way, but actually beating children, that sort of thing, I think was in existence.
Were there different reasons for which boys came into care than girls?
Well, the boys, of course, were involved more with running afoul of the law. That was the main reason for boys coming into care. But also in child protection, in neglect situations, there would be boys and girls, you see.
You had mentioned earlier that the churches were playing an important role, particularly regarding orphanages. Were there also other kinds of voluntary or private organizations involved in child welfare at the time?
There was never any family agency here, in Newfoundland. In the sense that of a private, family agency. In the Canadian provinces generally, and the urban centres, pretty much always found, I think, a family service agency operated by a private board. So that there wasn't that kind of organization here. Things that sort of, most of that, I suppose, would have been organized around child welfare services in the area of child protection. The only counselling, I would think, with families, for instance, would be in the area of child protection. And that was operated, of course, by government. So it was not private. It was government.
At some time during Newfoundland's early history after Confederation, there existed, I understand, social welfare boards, which were made up of members of government who passed on the eligibility of families or individuals for social assistance. Was there any of that kind of involvement in child welfare?
No, I don't think we were involved in that with that. That was in the social assistance area, I think. Yes, yes.
What kind of staff did you have in child welfare at that time? How many of you were there covering the province?
Well, in the administration, there wouldn't have been many staff, perhaps 6 or 7. There would be field staff, of course, working in various areas, all areas of Newfoundland, pretty much by that time. But the administrative staff wouldn't have been, I would say, would have been less than 10.
And as far as the field staff, did you have, again, starting at the beginning in 1953, would you have had specialized child welfare staff, or would people have been generalists and expected to do the entire range of social work activities in their various field locations?
It could be generalized, I think, pretty much at that time. I think when the legislation was first enacted in 1944, there was some specialization. But there were very few staff at that time anyway, or field staff. No staff, no field staff other than the larger centres. But I think in the 50s and then on, there wouldn't have been that kind of specialization for child protection workers or child care workers or adoption workers. Not as much, I think.
What were the issues in child welfare at that time during the years that you worked in that field?
I think adoption was an issue that was very important. We didn't have enough homes for children who were available for adoption, who needed permanent adoption homes. That was a big issue.
How did you do that?
Well, we used homes. The United States military personnel here. Of course, they were still here in the 1950s. And numbers of children were placed with families here. We would always get in touch with an agency in the United States where people had come from, so that we had a good deal of information on their history and their community, that sort of thing. And we did place quite a few children with American servicemen living here.
And then when the service people would be transferred elsewhere, the kids would go, they were permanent adoptions.
Yes, oh yes. They were legal adoptions. Probationary period of 1 year at that time, yes.
Were there private adoptions taking place at that time?
Private adoptions with relatives. For instance, an unmarried mother may want to place a child with a relative. And they would adopt the child. Unless there was neglect, we would approve the adoption of that kind of. It was legal for a mother to place her child with a blood relative.
Mm-hmm.
It was not legal in the Newfoundland legislation for anybody to place a child for adoption with somebody other than a relative without the approval of the director of child welfare.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there would be situations, of course, where a child would be placed with a family other than relatives. But we would, if the child had been there for any length of time, we would want to approve it.
Mm-hmm.
And unless it was the child was being neglected, we would do a study of the home with the hope that it would be approved.
Mm-hmm.
The child could remain there. But it was actually illegal in this province to place a child for adoption other than his relatives.
Mm-hmm. That was different from the experience of other Atlantic provinces.
I think so, yes.
Where they were private for profit
Yes.
maternity homes. Were there other issues that were important during that period of time?
Well, there was always the issue of finding good foster homes. I expect that was always an issue. Probably is everywhere. Probably has been everywhere. Finding good foster homes. Probably foster care and adoption
Mm-hmm.
were very important issues.
During that period of time, did you have much to do with the orphanages that existed?
Well, we would, of course, yes, there would be some children who would be at the orphanages who perhaps became available for adoption, where the parents had relinquished children for adoption, for instance. But we didn't have anything to do with the operation of the orphanages. They were operated by the churches.
Orphanages, at least the popular understanding are places where kids who do not have parents are sent because their parents have died.
Yes, yes.
It sounds as though that's not the proper usage of the term here in Newfoundland. There are children there for other reasons than the death of their parents.
Yes, certainly there were orphans at the orphanages, but there could be situations where a Newfoundland family, perhaps being close to the church, wanted a child placed at the orphanage rather than in a foster home. That sort of thing could happen.
And would your department be involved in that instance?
Yes, I think so. Generally would be involved. And of course, sometimes the director of child welfare asked the orphanage, perhaps 3 children that come into care, some neglect situation, and we wanted to keep the children together. Perhaps we had no foster home, perhaps, and the orphanage the children. There was that kind of relationship with the orphanages, certainly.
Mm-hmm. The other question that occurs to me, and again about that period of time, is the relationship of unemployment, which Newfoundland has been plagued with many years, and its effect on child welfare. Employment in Newfoundland is often seasonal. Did you see an effect of that on your work in child welfare?
In what sense?
I was wondering about the possibility of, as a family's income during the non-fishing months might decline, they might, for financial reasons primarily, that the children might end up as one of your woods, and then when the money came in again, as it might 6 months, the kids might go back out to their home. Did that kind of thing ever occur?
Well, with fishermen, of course. In 1957, I believe it was, the fishermen came under the unemployment insurance legislation, so that there was unemployment insurance for fishermen during the months of winter, when there would be no fishing. Well, there was always fishing throughout the year, on the south coast of Newfoundland, but certainly on the northeast coast, at the coast of Labrador, there wouldn't be any fishing at all, you see, in the months of winter. But in 1957, that was very important that fishermen were covered under the unemployment insurance program. Prior to that, I would say that people somehow managed, because of the fact that they produced so much of their own food.
They were able to do that in some places, I guess.
Oh, yes. You see, Newfoundland was largely rural. Largely rural, you see. People living in coastal communities. They provided a great deal of their own food.
I was thinking back to what you mentioned earlier about labeling Newfoundland the rock and the difficulty of growing things in some places.
In some places, yes.
Yeah.
For instance, on the south, there are areas of the south coast where it's so rocky that growing a kitchen garden would be an achievement.
Yeah.
More than an achievement. Yes.
I guess what I'm thinking about is the amazing effect that the climate and the topography of this province have affected, how they have affected social welfare, social needs, and services that it has answered.
Newfoundland people are very resourceful, They have to be very resourceful in order to survive through the centuries. And so it is amazing how they managed as well as they did.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, maybe that would be a good place to take a break. Are we all right with you? Okay. We're resuming our interview in St. John's with Ms. Ella Brett. Ms. Brett, we've been talking about your first social work job in child welfare. I'm wondering if you could describe your involvement with the Professional Association, the Newfoundland Association, and the CASW.
Yes, well, I've been a member of the Professional Association since 1953. I'm not sure when the Professional Association started. Not long before that, I guess.
It was somewhere very close to that.
Yes. But as soon as I became involved in social work, I became a member of the profession. I was always very interested in that. It seems to me it's very important, really, to be a member of the professional association. I didn't hold office as much. I was Newfoundland's representative on the national board for a few years. And of course that was really quite interesting. Usually the meetings were somewhere on the mainland of Canada. You know how we talk about the mainland. Newfoundland is an island, of course, you see. And the mainland of Canada is over there. So the meetings, and it was very interesting, to meet people from other parts of Canada. Newfoundland, there is isolation. It's very good to get off the island and to visit other parts of Canada and to know what's happening, of course, in other parts of Canada. So I enjoyed very much my association with the Professional Association always.
When you were on the national board, do you have a recollection of the kind of issues that were being dealt with by the association at that time?
I don't remember offhand what the issues were. Um, I think there was some interest in what was happening, that there weren't enough professional social workers. And of course, a lot of people involved in social work who didn't have enough training or education to help them do their jobs better. I think that was always a big issue.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly it was at the time that I was Newfoundland's representative on the board.
Mm-hmm.
It's less so now, I think. There would be more professional social workers
Mm-hmm.
in jobs.
When you joined the Newfoundland Association, who were your colleagues and how many of them were there?
Oh, there were very few, perhaps about 6. I'm not sure exactly, but I mean, there were very few of us. Very few. We were a very small branch of the association, but that was nice in some ways, you know. I mean, we would have liked more, but nevertheless, you know, very small group is kind of nice.
Mm-hmm.
And it grew, you know. We had a few more members from time to time.
Do you remember who some of your other members were at that time?
Well, Frida Berry is a member, of course, of the association. Margaret Garland. She had worked in the mental health field, Margaret Garland. Let me see. I can't remember names.
Mm-hmm.
People, some of the people involved. I didn't think of anyone at that time. There were very few.
One of the questions that I wonder about is in regard to your administrative role in child welfare and your role as a professional social worker. It seems to me to be happening in some places today that administration of social programs is being done by people who don't have social work training. I'm wondering if, looking back on your career, whether your social work knowledge was particularly helpful in the administrative roles that you carried out.
Oh, yes. Oh, I would definitely say yes. Now, I don't mean by that there were people who had no social work training who did very good work, you know. Much better work, perhaps, than was always recorded, in the sense that they were good human beings and were able to be quite helpful. But I think it's the training is most helpful, of course, to the person who is motivated and who wants to be helpful, and therefore the training is more useful to that kind of person. Well, yes, I would think definitely that training was important in the administration of services.
Can you describe ways in which you can see an effect of that being a social worker made you a better administrator of a child welfare program?
I think one of the things is that once you get into a profession, you're more inclined to have journals, for instance, to read more, in the sense of what's going on in the professions and what's going on in the area of social services generally. I think that's a big factor. That's the way I felt about it anyway, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It was more likely that somebody who had social work training was receiving periodicals and journals, reading literature.
Mm-hmm. I can see where that would be an important contribution to your work as administrator. When you had been in the child welfare field for a number of years and decided to make a change, could you tell us why you decided to make a change and what you decided to do then?
Well, in 1963, I had been working with the Department of Social Services in administration of children's services, of course. And in 1963, Memorial University here decided to design a 2-year diploma course in public welfare. This was the university's response to a need in the community. The Department of Public Welfare, which became the Department of Social Services later on, had very heavy responsibilities in this province. In other provinces, there were private agencies, there were children's aid societies. But the Department of Public Welfare in Newfoundland had a lot on its plate. And that department had tried to provide training for its staff. For instance, a few people had gone to the Toronto School of Social Work, and some faculty from the School of Social Work had come here during the summers for in-service training. But now the university decided to offer a 2-year diploma course in public welfare. I think Professor John Morgan at the Toronto School of Social Work was very much involved in the design of that program. There were 3 courses in public welfare. There were the other courses, of course, were in the humanities and in the social sciences, particularly. But they wanted a course that was not just technical, there would be courses in the humanities and the social sciences as well as in the courses in public welfare. Then, that was in 1963, so I was a visiting lecturer for one of the public welfare courses. I carried on my position with the Department of Social Services, but I was a visiting lecturer to teach one course in that diploma course. 2 years later, in 1965, the university decided to broaden the program and introduced a degree program, a Bachelor of Arts with a social welfare option. Now, this was not designed as a professional course in social work. It was never called that. It was a Bachelor of Arts degree with a social welfare option. Again, there was great emphasis on the humanities, the social sciences. There were 5 or 6 courses in social welfare.
Mm-hmm.
So that at that point, in 1965, I went to the university as a full-time faculty person.
Mm-hmm.
And there were visiting lecturers, of course, to do courses. I did 2 courses at that time in that degree program. There were visiting lecturers for the others. And that program continued until 1970 or 1971, when the university moved to a professional degree program in social work.
Mm-hmm.
That was some years later, of course. And new faculty, of course, came in. And I remained at the university to teach. That program is now in operation at Memorial University.
Mm-hmm.
But that developed from way back with the diploma course in public welfare.
When you first came, what courses were you teaching?
I was teaching courses in the social services, generally, the history and the development of social policy in Canada, particularly, of course, but not only in Canada, the United States and certainly Britain. Other people were involved in casework or interviewing these kinds of courses.
Mm-hmm.
I was involved in the social policy area.
Mm-hmm. Who were some of the other people who were teaching at school at that time?
You mean way back in the...
Just passing it back in. Oh, it's still on your calendar.
What is it?
I better not to keep passing around that silver band. It's just a couple of yeah, I think that's okay. Doug, could you check the sound again on both microphones?
Okay, I'm in. It's perfect.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I was thinking about when you first went to the department. Is that right to call it a department in 1963? The Department of Social Services at the school.
No, I was a faculty member, really. There was no department as such. A faculty member in the Department of Social Studies, really, at that earlier. It became School of Social Work, of course, later on in 1970, when the professional degree program came to be used.
I was wondering who else was teaching social work courses or courses for social workers in 1963 when you first went.
In the public welfare course. Caleb Reynolds was teaching online. A social worker whose name was Russell, I've forgotten his first name, was involved. George Pope was involved.
Mm-hmm.
You interviewed, I think, yesterday.
Yes, right.
But at that time, of course, there were not that many courses, you see. I mean, it was a broadly based program. It was not intended as being purely technical or in-service training. It was supposed to be a university program.
Mm-hmm.
There weren't many courses in public welfare.
No. Were there many students at the time?
Oh, yes, but students were very interested in the program.
Mm-hmm.
Quite interested. I think there must have been a couple of hundred students. Not at that point, but certainly I would say around 68. 68 it had grown to around 200 students, I think, in the program.
Oh, that's really
So that was, yes, and the university, of course, recognized that there was great interest and recognized the need for training, on the part of people working in social work.
Speaking of the need, in your mind, were there particular needs that a Newfoundland school and set of courses in social welfare had to address itself to?
I think perhaps the main thing was that, most of the people working in social work were working with the provincial government department.
Mm-hmm.
There were not private agencies very much here.
Mm-hmm.
And it was around the responsibilities of the Department of Social Services, I think, in the areas of income maintenance, the areas of child welfare services, in services for juveniles who would run afoul of the law, and the operation of institutions. There was certainly that. I think that was the reason that the program had been started.
Mm-hmm.
I expect that the Department of Social Services asked the university if it would design a program that would help them. The program at the university was not designed by the Department of Social Services of the provincial government or anything. I think the provincial government was interested in the university tackling the problem and trying to design a program. The Toronto School of Social Work was involved in it.
In helping set
Yes.
set
Helping to design it, yes.
One of the things that strikes me about being so different about Newfoundland, among many, in the area of teaching social welfare, administration is the size and the geographic distance. Just a matter of communication between wherever head office is, whether it's here or Twillingate, with the places that are further away because the population is so dispersed.
Yes.
Was that an issue that figured at all in your instruction of students?
Yes, although roads, communications were much better once we became part of Canada. And of course, there weren't as many communities at one time. I suppose at the time of the Confederation in 1949, I think there were about 1,300 small fishing villages scattered around the coast. It was very difficult to provide services under those circumstances, you see, not only in the field of health and welfare, but also education, postal services, whatever. And but of course there aren't that many now. But certainly that was a problem. But the area was covered pretty much, you see, by field workers.
Mm-hmm.
They had large areas, to cover, and gradually, as we were able to get more staff, of course, services became much better.
Mm-hmm. I do want to ask you some questions about the whole number of resettlement programs that occurred, but maybe we could do that after we talked about your time in Memorial. That would be okay.
Yes.
During the time that you were at Memorial, what kind of discussion took place about training social workers as far as whether or not they should be generalists or specialists? Was that something you had to do with?
I think it was generalist approach. Yes, always I think generalist approach.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are people in various areas who had to do everything. With a population scattered around the coastline, it's very difficult to provide specialist services.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the two towns and in St. John's, it would be quite different. But for the rest of Newfoundland, it would have to be a generalist approach
Mm-hmm.
services.
Did the students have to do field placements?
And not in the early program. Although they learned a lot, some of the students, from getting summer employment, perhaps with the Department of Social Services, or perhaps with the parole board on some of these, but it was not, the field component was not really developed too well until it became a professional social work degree program. Then, of course, the field component, to meet standards, the field component had to be a very important part of the program.
Mm-hmm.
Under supervision of the School of Social Work, you see, in Memorial.
Mm-hmm. Were you at all involved in that when it came about?
I was not involved very much in the field program. Well, I knew about it, of course, but I was not actually involved in supervising field units.
Mm-hmm.
Other people were involved in it, other faculties.
As you taught social policy throughout those years, were there particular policy questions that you were encouraging your students to think about and discuss?
Well, I suppose there were many issues, and certainly what I was teaching would have a Newfoundland slant. Although I didn't particularly want it to be that wholly. That's I wanted to be broader than that. But certainly there was a Newfoundland slant because, most people were going to be working in Newfoundland. Some people would be working outside Newfoundland and would be coming back to Newfoundland. Some students would want to get away to get some experience and perhaps would return, which I always thought was a good idea anyway. And but I think issues certainly in Newfoundland would be very much part of our teaching. Had to be really, you see, but not wholly.
Were there particular policies that were somewhat or totally unique to Newfoundland that other provinces might have had to consider?
I don't think so. I'm not sure that there were. Once we became Canada, see, I think although we didn't become part of Canada overnight, we've been part of Canada for only 35 years. And 35 years is not a very long time, really, when you consider that our history goes back for 300 years. But nevertheless, once we became part of Canada, I think we tried to integrate it, with the Canadian scene, really. And the programs and services, of course, became the programs and services that were available throughout Canada.
Perhaps I could ask you a couple of questions specific to St. John's and the policy line, and see whether or not those were issues of discussion here during the time that you were teaching policy. St. John's had a poorhouse until relatively recently in history. It had orphanages until relatively recently. We had the lunatic until, which I guess is the Waterford Hospital.
Yes.
Were those kinds of institutions, was the continuing existence of those kinds of institutions a matter of discussion as a policy issue during your tenure?
I don't know when the Home for the Aged and Infirm, that was often referred to as the poorhouse. I'm not sure when that folded, that particular institution.
Late 60s, I think.
Late 60s, right? Yes. The Waterford Hospital was called the Hospital for Mental and Nervous Diseases. I think it was way back that it was called an asylum. I don't think that it would have been called an asylum in the 1950s, 1960s. It would have been called the Hospital for Mental and Nervous Diseases. It's now called the Waterford Hospital. These were the two institutions, of course. The institutions played a large role in social welfare in Canada, in the United States, in Britain, and so on. The institutions played such a large role. The Salvation Army operated a home for unmarried mothers here, for many years. It's a very important contribution to social welfare of Newfoundland. Of course, we had the jails and the penitentiaries. There was a penitentiary, but we had the jails. But there is just one orphanage here now. There's one orphanage in St. John's now.
At this time, there's one.
Yes, there is one. I don't imagine the children are orphans. Unless it's been closed out recently, I don't think it has. But the orphanages, they played a part. They were important during the period in which they operated. I guess it was in the 1960s that the old Home for the Aged and Infirm finally died. I think it was the 1970s.
Yeah, I brought that question up not to be at all critical of developments in Newfoundland, but as an illustration of progress in social work in this country. And in some places, the progress began earlier, and in some places it began later.
Yes.
But we haven't had what we have today for very long.
No, that's right. Yes.
Were there during the time that you were teaching at Memorial, what was it like to teach policy to people who probably weren't going to do policy work?
I think that is a problem. Because the students were young, often, but young. And they were more interested in courses in interviewing, for instance, casework and group work. So, and I think the courses in social policy were more difficult to teach because the motivation in the beginning, the students were not highly motivated in that area. If they had been out and working, of course, and had come to the university to do courses, then they were motivated, you see. But if they hadn't been working in the area of social work at all, I think it was much harder to motivate students in courses in social policy than in other courses.
Mm-hmm. Yes. What particular methods did you use to try and motivate your people to become more interested in policy?
Oh, I don't know. You tried everything you could, in teaching. I often found, though, that students were very interested in the life and work of some of the great social reformers. In the United States, in England, in Canada. They often became very interested in their research in that area.
Mm-hmm.
Interested in both the lives and the work of social reformers. It was often a motivating factor, I felt.
Mm-hmm.
They were very interested in it, became very interested in it.
Good that you can find ways to do that.
Yes.
To go back for just a minute then, away from Memorial and back to a series of general questions which are leading us toward a close. The other major thing that I'm aware of that happened during the 25 years or so, 25-year period from mid-40s to maybe earlier mid-70s was the whole issue of resettlement programs. Essentially closing some of the outports and moving people to other urbanized centers. How were you affected by that particular movement, if at all?
You mean in teaching?
Well, did you see that it had an effect on your students, on their clients, on your job, on the way that you thought about social policy?
I think that the resettlement program was the intentions of government were good. It was felt that it was too difficult to provide services in some very small coastal communities, and if people moved to larger areas, things would be better. There were growth centres. The provincial government had earmarked as growth centres. Now, often they were not growth centres. They didn't become growth centres, and the people really couldn't find the employment that certainly they needed above anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually they would have been better off from the point of view of employment if they had remained in small communities and had engaged in the fishing industry as they had always done. Some of it was successful, I expect, and some of it was not. It was difficult, I think, for government looking at the whole picture of so many small fishing villages scattered around 6,000 miles of coastline, you see. And the cost of providing services was enormous, you see. But it was certainly a topic for discussion in teaching, because many of the students, you see, had come from areas that were resettled, or communities that were resettled. Or there was, right at that time, discussion in the area about whether or not they would resettle.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was always a topic for discussion in teaching.
I'm wondering if, as you look back over your career in social welfare, can you identify some, or what changes would you identify that have really affected social welfare in Newfoundland? What are the big things that have made a difference in this province?
The big things that have made a difference. Well, I suppose the big thing was our decision to go into Confederation. You know, that was the big event.
Mm-hmm.
From there on, I think that many of the programs and services were geared to providing as much as possible services to Newfoundland comparable to the services provided in other provinces of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I think the whole idea of training, of education in the area of public welfare was a real contribution here, because of the fact that we didn't have private agencies too much. I think that the Department of Public Welfare, in its desire to try to help its people do a better job, I think that was very important. I think the beginnings of a professional social work degree program grew out of that desire
Mm-hmm.
for trying to equip people to do their jobs
Mm-hmm.
in what is, after all, a difficult field. It's not an easy field to work in. It seems to me that was very important.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, I was involved in that, and I suppose I would, but I think even if I were not involved in the actual teaching of the program, I think I would see that as a major thing. Yes.
Again, as you look back over your career, I wonder if there's particular challenges that you can identify, things that perhaps made your work a little more difficult than you had wished it would have been.
You mean in teaching?
In that or in child welfare.
Yes. I think it was always difficult, considering Newfoundland's geography and the fact that we have a small population so dispersed over so many small communities. That was always a challenge, to try to provide services. That was so in the area of child welfare as much as in any other service in the social welfare field. I think the challenge, of course, again, of trying to help those who were working in the social welfare field to become better educated.
Mm-hmm.
To be able to help their clients. That certainly was a challenge. I'm sure there are others that I know there are others.
What about on the other side of the coin, the other side of the fence, the accomplishments, things that you did that you feel quite satisfied that happened?
Oh, well, I was always very interested. I mean, I've always been interested, you see, in mostly public health and public welfare or social services. You know, I began my career in the area of public health and then moved into the area of social work. I was always very interested in government because in Newfoundland, government has such large responsibilities. And I hope certainly that certainly in the field of child welfare that it's tiny contribution, I hope.
Mm-hmm.
It was always very interesting. I enjoyed it very much. I don't think it's easy. I don't think these jobs are easy by any means. I work very hard. Teaching is certainly not an easy field. I certainly enjoy teaching, but I found it difficult. I think it's an area that really does take a lot out of you. Perhaps teaching in the field of social work is more difficult than in some areas of teaching. You know.
Could you tell me what was difficult about the teaching? Can you identify certain things that made it tough?
Well, of course, I think it's so for a lot of people who go into teaching. I have no training really in teaching. A lot of people go into teaching in the universities who don't. They know their subject, but from the point of view of teaching skills, a lot of people have not been involved in that sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I think in teaching, you know, what you taught last year, you can't teach this year.
Because things change?
Because things change so much, and you have to be on top of things. You have to be reading continuously, you know, and you know, you're. It's almost an intrusion on your personal life. I think because you never feel really that you've done enough. You know, that is difficult, I think. And I think it's not possible to feel that you have done enough. You know, particularly those years, certainly when I was involved in teaching, things were changing all the time.
Mm-hmm.
One did have to try to keep up with what was going on.
Mm-hmm. If you were starting out tomorrow, brand new, a new career, a new social work career, but knowing what you know now, where would you begin? What needs to be done?
Well, I've been away from the field now for, you know, I've been retired for 40 years. But I've always been interested in the so-called social outcasts. You know, the really, the most needful people in society. You know, the people who are, you know, they get a job, the last to be hired, the first to be fired. May not have too many abilities, but we need to live a fulfilling life just as well as anybody else. People who are alcoholics, for instance, involved in the abuse of alcohol. Unmarried parents, for instance, too, certainly. And I think that would be my interest now,
Mm-hmm.
would be serving people that find it very difficult really to get service that is useful to them.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly that's the area that I particularly like, and that usually means government service, because government is ultimately responsible
Mm-hmm.
for persons unable to look after themselves. I suppose it's responsible for providing a minimum in the way of social and economic protection to every citizen. Private agencies don't have that mandate. They can choose their clientele much better, much more so, than government can. And so I think I would be interested in services operated by government.
That leads me to ask a question about that. If government doesn't provide that basic level of services, what do you think the role of a social worker is?
If government doesn't, well, I think private agencies can do things that public agencies can't. But there hasn't been that kind of trend in Newfoundland, you see. No children's aid societies were ever formed here. There were no such agencies as the Family Service Bureau, Family Service Agency. I think if these agencies were involved or were interested in providing service, to the so-called social outcasts, the people really most needful, then I would want to work with a private agency. Well, at least that's the way I feel at the present time.
Well, if you continue on in your volunteer work, you may have the opportunity to find out.
Yes.
I wonder if, in closing, Ms. Brett, there's anything that you'd like to add?
No, I think not. I think I always had very interesting work to do. And I think it is a wonderful thing to get paid for work that you find interesting, because there are so many people who work in very routine jobs that they hate. Some people just hate these routine, repetitive jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me to be able to earn a living, doing work that you like to do, is something for which to feel grateful.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to thank you very much for the time that you spent with us this morning, and say how much I've enjoyed it and appreciate it very much. Cooperation is very welcome. Thanks.
It's very nice. Are you done?
Mm-hmm. That's it. My name is Karen Hill. I'm in St. John's, Newfoundland. Today is the 29th day of February 1984, and I'm interviewing Miss Ella Brett. This is the Oral History Project of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Miss Brett, in order to begin, I wonder if I might ask you to tell us when and where you were born, and a little bit about your early life.
Just stare straight ahead and just, you don't need to nod your head or anything. Just hold that now. Just turn the other way to sort of face that way. I don't know where. Okay, that's good. Yeah.